All right. All right. It's 4 o'clock. Welcome everyone to another edition of Tumor Talk. This is the collaborative effort between the Journal of Neuro-Oncology and Lenox Hill Neurosurgery, where we highlight recent publications in the Journal of Neuro-Oncology and talk about the rationale, the results, and really the relevance of them. Today, kind of consistent with some previous webinars, we have the great pleasure to bring you Dr. Shagru. And today's talk is being presented by Omniscient, which is a company that I'm sure Dr. Shagru will talk a little bit about, but which has provided us with an educational grant to be able to do this, and we're very grateful for that. It's a program that is kind of cloud-based and allows us the ability to look at connectomics within patients. It's something we've never really been able to do before. And Dr. Shagru is going to talk a little bit about what that means and how we can start thinking about how to do surgery safer. And it's a real pleasure to have you here. If you want to introduce yourself and take us through.
Well, hi everyone. I'm Mike Shagru, and as Randy pointed out, we founded a company that does connectomics. Today we're talking a little bit more about the future. We don't currently make any products that are directly related to this, but hopefully one day we can, once we gain better understanding of what all this means, we will have a better path forward towards actually being able to utilize these tools in clinical practice. And that was kind of the goal of what we were doing with this paper, was to basically use some things that are on the cutting edge of neuroscience, and more importantly, start to dive into, well, there's a lot of really great work in this area. What does it mean pragmatically for patients and for us actually using these kind of things in the real world? Because these topics have actually been published a lot, but I was at a meeting where a really prominent neuroscientist named Carl Friston said, this is all very interesting stuff, guys, but what does this actually mean? And that inspired me to look into this and say, well, what does it mean? And what we came up with is an idea that at least one of these measures that we'll talk about gives us an insight into what eloquence really means and how we might identify areas of the brain that are eloquent that we didn't know that were eloquent. So I think really what we're trying to get at is that we're pretty good at certain things in neurosurgery, preserving motor, preserving speech, but we struggle in a lot of other areas. And particularly when we start looking at gliomas, not only do these patients have a very high rate of having cognitive problems before surgery, we often make them quite a bit worse, depending on how you define cognitive dysfunction. Many of them range into the level of being actually a formal disability, but either way, there's a lot to improve on here. And part of the reason that I think that we struggle with this problem is we don't really know how the cognitive is organized, how to prioritize things. And we work with a model like this. So we talk about eloquence and we say these are the areas. You can see this is kind of a rough idea of where eloquent areas are. And they typically involve the speech and motor pathways. So Broca's area, Wernicke's area, the visual system, the motor cortex, and some other areas. This is what Spetzler and Martin used. I just use this as an example because this is usually the first time anyone had to memorize a list of what are the eloquent areas. But you can see there's a large part of the brain that is basically, we're given free rein to do whatever we want. And we know there's anatomy there. And again, millions of years of evolution went into creating that part of the brain. And we don't really think about what to do there and how do we assess value in that part of the brain. And so one of the problems is that not everyone has the same amount of importance to all these areas. So first, there's parts of the people who you do relatively safe appearing surgeries in the frontal lobe or the parietal lobe. And while they don't end up on the M&M list necessarily, they come back multiple times telling you everything that's wrong with their life. And we obviously didn't do that patient the level of service that we'd like to. And then the flip side is that there are people that you can often get away with removing parts of the brain, particularly if there's a tumor, but parts of the brain that are eloquent. So some people have more tolerance for operating in the eloquent areas than others. So we don't really know how to assess that before surgery. We don't have any metric in this. And one of the problems is that when we start thinking about things in binaries, then we obviously, there's imperfect predictive value. We don't really necessarily have a metric or a good idea to look at the gray zone to say that something might be kind of eloquent or might cause a problem, to some degree. or might be able to be compensated for. And so this is where the concept of the connectome came to. Whereas while we know that there's anatomy and we have to think about certain parts of the brain doing certain things, there's a lot of different ways that a signal can be transmitted between two areas. While there are areas in pathways that are better at doing it because they're shorter, essentially there's lots of different ways the brain can solve the same problem in many cases. So while the corticospinal tract is kind of a sacrosanct issue because it's the only thing connected to the outside world as far as the motor system, a lot of other different cognitive tasks can be solved lots of different ways. And so the concept of a connectome based search is the idea that the answer is in there somewhere. Because of the complexity and size of the data, you need methods that come out of network theory or complexity theory to be able to handle it. And so one of the most popular ones is graph theory. Now, graph theory has been around for a very long time, but it really became popularized in the late 1990s when computers could run lots of iterations on these things, making them pragmatic. But also, it was found to be a very powerful way to look at the interaction between complex systems. So if the brain can solve a problem multiple different ways, we need to be able to account for that. And so I think the best way to describe what graph theory is that if you look at the brain like a giant math equation, then you can run experiments on the brain and learn things you may not necessarily be obvious to the naked eye. In fact, maybe in some cases impossible. And so the way you do this, there's a lot of different ways you do this fMRI, but in this case we used DTI and we used tractography. We parcellate it because you have to assign nodes and edges. So nodes are the circles, the edges are the lines. And you have to calculate how many fibers go between every area and every other area. And so what you get on the far right is a giant math equation of all the relationships between all the parts of the brain. Now, this is a massive data set. So it basically has about 144,000 entries. And so this is a lot of data to work with. Again, what you end up doing then is you run experiments to try to learn things about it. And one of the things that's the most interesting and where we started first in our foray into graph theory was hubness. So hubs most obviously are the kind of grand central stations of this network. It's how information flows on the graph. And these are the areas that are the most connected. So a hub is an area that is extremely connected to other parts of the brain. There are lots of different ways to measure it, which we'll go into. But the bottom line is the reason hubs are interesting is that they have been shown through different ways to do multiomics to express different gene expression patterns. They use energy differently. They use more energy, and they're actually more susceptible to diseases like Alzheimer's for that reason, because they're thought to overheat. In fact, when you look at it, the difference between normal aging and aging is that the hubs or in dementing disorders is that normal aging, you lose everything in equal amounts. So that's why people can have significant atrophy, but not be demented. But in dementing disorders, you lose the hubs more preferentially because the disease is targeting them. And so it isn't just that you lose neurons, it's actually that you lose them, the important ones. And then if you basically make a democracy in the brain, you can't function. Some things need to be more important than others. So because of the importance of hubs, we decided there are a lot of different ways to look at hubs. In fact, there's some other ways that we didn't even study here that study hubness in a different way of how information flows. But these are the simple ones of what we call the centralities. And the simplest one on the left is degree, which just says how many things connect to you. In this case, how many fibers go into you compared to everyone else. The problem with it is that it assumes that being connected to side hubs or irrelevant areas are less important than being connected to hubs, or equally important. And eigenvector centrality in the middle does this a little differently by giving you more weight to something that has more connection. So if you're connected to an important area, you get more points. But the issue is PageRank centrality, which again comes from Google. They're actually the people who first described this, and it was the original search algorithm, gives you more important points if you're connected to multiple hubs. So again, for example, an important website that has lots of people linking to it is more important than a site that just links to google.com, because again, it may be misrepresentative. So we looked at all of these, and the first thing that we found, and we use PageRank for a reason I'll describe in a bit. First thing we found is that high centrality areas often line up very closely to the typical eloquent areas. So these are 10, or 8 subjects. And if you were scoring an AVM or looking at areas that tend to be eloquent, all those red boxes fit into one of those areas, or at least are right around there. And so ultimately, hubs are generally eloquent areas. Now, notice it's not 100%, and everyone's hubs are a little bit different, which is kind of what we were expecting to see. But again, at least 55% of the top 20 areas in everybody were areas that we call traditionally eloquent. So they're overrepresented, given there aren't that many eloquent areas. Now, if we look at it, there aren't that many areas that even would qualify as an important part of any network that show up at the bottom of the list in anyone. So if you look at those blue squares, none of those would actually get you a Spencer Martin point, but we wanted to play the devil's advocate. These are actually some parts of the default mode network, for example, it's important, but it isn't an eloquent area in the traditional sense. So if you look at, we looked at which one of these works the best. The reason we picked PageRank is that it actually is the most likely to nail down eloquent regions in an individual, or at least to align with our typical areas. So if you look at this, we gave it a score, we called it a Goff score, which essentially says, what's the chance that if you add up all of the eloquent areas, and you add up all their PageRank and all the people, what is the chance that that number is higher than we expect? And it turns out the other centralities sometimes misrepresent it. So just being connected to a bunch of people doesn't necessarily make you're more likely to be eloquent, but specifically if you're connected to a lot of very important people, a lot of people want to talk to the motor cortex, for example, because you're talking to the outside world, you're probably important. And so again, this is kind of why we think PageRank is the best one, why we used it. And PageRank of all of them seem to most consistently line up with eloquent areas. So again, if you sit down and think about this, you can imagine this being a tool that we start to look at someone's centrality ahead of time and say, well, okay, we're going to go into this area. Is it a hub? And if it's a hub, even if it's not necessarily what we think, for example, if we have a hub up here, should we reconsider a better approach? Maybe we take that sulcus instead of going through there. This gets very complex, and this is why we haven't completely turned this into a clinical paradigm. But you can imagine this could be a very powerful tool for telling us traps that we didn't even know existed. And again, this shows you the power of having a tool that can look at 144,000 things and sort them out for you. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Mike. I mean, I've been following along with Connectome work now since basically, you developed the company, and each and every talk I hear is more fascinating than the last one. So first of all, congratulations on the work you and your team have put out. And I think I speak on behalf of Jason when I say thank you for, choosing the Journal of Neuro-Oncology to publish in. My question to you is kind of what you just alluded to is, how do we take this now? You gave one example of turning this into a clinical use, right? So maybe designing our surgical approaches. What else, if you want to speak, maybe understanding our deficits or understanding, things outside of neurosurgery and more in psychiatric illness or just degenerative neurology. How do we use this now clinically, or where do you see this going in the future?
I think there's a couple things. The first is that the most obvious way you could use it, and the way we've thought about it, is if you flag not just telling people that the motor cortex is important is not a helpful tool, right? We kind of all know that. But can you flag this and say, hey, this is an area that's a hub in this person that you didn't know about? And maybe it's right up against the cancer, and you're going to do a biopsy if you try to save this. That's a different beast, right? Oncological decisions sometimes have to override functional decisions because of reality. But if you were picking a path to something, or you could change the approach, or you could leave 1% of the tumor to save a hub and leave someone's cognition substantially better, that might actually make sense in some cases. So that's the first thing, is just flagging. You didn't know this was here, but by the way, which is actually what we all want, right? Just, hey, listen, you might think about this. I think one of the challenges is we're beginning to learn how to do network neurosurgery with the kind of tools that are out there. How do we we're already trying to balance a lot of demands. But one of the things that you can imagine is the question that's coming up over and over again, which is, okay, if a network is invaded by tumor, like let's say the anterior part of the default mode network is cancer in it, can I get away with it? Well, centrality might be a way to get at that, right? I mean, we have to have a way to break the tie, which is nobody wants to go push the resection 3% more and wreck somebody or hurt someone badly doing it. But we also know that sometimes you can get away with it because, well, the brain's been reactivated, the network's been inactivated for a long time. They've been working with one. But the problem is that it's not a hard predictor, and we need better measurements for it. I think the next thing, and this isn't published yet, we just are polishing up the final parts of this paper, but we did a massive 3-year project that followed this, and it took us a long time to sort this out. But essentially, in short, we created an algorithm to run every possible brain surgery on a graph, starting from removing one parcel to removing an entire lobe. So we ran every combination on hundreds and hundreds of people. And the thing that we found is that there's some very complex higher order relationships that are hard to explain, but essentially there's about 3 to 4 patterns of what is the worst place to be in like say the medial parietal lobe. And you're either one or the other, right? It's actually mutually exclusive. There's very few people in the middle ground. So if I know where your hub in that lobe is, I can predict which connectotype and tell you which part of the lobe to be in. And now sometimes that's just not an option, right? There's only one way to get to, if you have a superficial cav mal, like it's pointless. But if you're talking about, I need to do a very large, corticectomy to get to this thing, then it will tell you where to be. Or if I'm going to put a brain path cannula, this is where you want to not be in this person. So you can imagine how you could design approaches that basically preserve, I guess the best way to think about it is the brain's topology. And one of the things, if you get into deeper concepts of the connectome, the term topology comes out of geometry, right? So it's a field that took off in the 20th century. And it says, well, we're not so concerned about the distance, we're concerned about the relationship, what parts are next to each other, even if they're in a different shape. So for example, you can take a ball and make it into a coffee cup. If you can't make it into a coffee cup, but you make a donut into a coffee cup by warping it. Without cutting or moving anything. And what the concept of topology makes sense is when you start thinking about tracks and connectivity. So for example, the frontal pole and the occipital lobe are far in actual distance, but they're close topologically because they're directly connected by IFOF. And so what starts happening is when you work in graphs, you actually work topologically. So the distance isn't so much how far are you, because the brain conducts that in milliseconds. It's actually how many steps does it take to get from point A to point B. So there may be parts of the contralateral hemisphere that are topologically 2 steps away. And whereas, connecting something in the posterior frontal lobe and the medial inferior occipital lobe is topologically extremely far, even though it might be physically closer. And so these kind of complex relationships can only be figured out with this kind of technique. And we'll learn things as we go. It's just, first we wanted to have is the simple way to say, okay, what does the thing basically mean? And what we came to the conclusion in this paper is that, and believe it or not, there's a lot of work on centrality, but no one had ever just said, what does centrality basically mean? And from a clinical standpoint, it basically means you're kind of eloquent. If you cut it, you're more likely to get a deficit than other areas.
Have you noticed? Oh, go ahead, Mike. Jason, sorry.
No, I was going to say, really impressive work, Mike, and I can't be more delighted that you're publishing in JNO on this. I think it's truly fascinating as you think about your ability to develop these networks and define these hubs. Obviously it has ramifications for open surgery, but as I listened to your talk again, because I've heard some other discussions and obviously read papers on this, yours included, one wonders about the potential ramifications of this around other things. For instance, you impart energy, through focus ultrasound, and how is it affecting the networks, and also in radiosurgery, how is it affecting the, and if you had better defined the networks, you might think about doing something even in a closed brain operation that might spare a network or deliver that energy in a different way. So I mean, I think that you're clearly onto something that goes far beyond the kinds of things that we all learned in medical school and in medical school neuroscience classes, which was in so many ways important when it was discovered, but certainly nowhere close to the ability that we now have to be able to better define these complex networks in the setting of challenging pathology, be it as you've shown ABMs or in the setting of tumors. I think these and anything deep-seated, or as Randy indicated, maybe the setting of neurodegenerative disorders too. So, what are sort of, in your mind, what would you think would be the most likely scenarios where this would impact brain tumor surgery in the next 3 to 5 years? I mean, I know it's already impacting some, but where do you see it impacting for those who are on the audience who are really neurosurgical, neuro-oncology focused, and what should they be expecting to see that with your from your vantage point? I'd be delighted to have your insights in that regard. What's coming down the pipeline?
Well, I think there's a couple things and I'll run through from most obvious to most futuristic. So the most obvious thing, and what people were doing at DTI in the past, was to make, when you go on a path to a deep tumor, don't go through the middle of something that's really important, like the arcuate fasciculus, for example. And that's pretty solid, and I think it's probably always best to not go through the corticospinal tract on the way to your tumor if you can, if at all possible. What we try to, the challenge with it, of course, is that if you just use tracks by themselves, they're noisy, right? So you don't know what twigs are important. And what Connectomics adds on top of that in the concept of networks, it says these twigs are important, these twigs are less important, because we have to prioritize something, right? We have to put value, and this is a better path than this path. And we know that's basically true because we've all seen this in real life. We just don't want, before having a construct like the default mode network to say this is a bad thing to go through, then we didn't have a really good way to do that. But of course, when you start talking about radiation or radiosurgery, one thing we know for sure is that different connectivity and different structures have differential sensitivity to radiation. So the optic nerve is a lot more sensitive than other things. So if you look at the white matter structure of the brain, essentially it's a bunch of optic nerves all wrapped into each other. It's the same tissue, right? It's just the optic nerve happens to be external, right? And so while there may be other things like the lack of, maybe these parts of the brain insulate each other, the idea that there's probably parts of the white matter that are more differentially sensitive, it seems very likely that, and we know because all of us have seen someone get a bunch of radiation, and then you see this kind of longitudinal, you don't really ever see it following, the optic radiation specifically, at least not very often. So the point of it is there's a lot there that we don't know. And right now, what we didn't have in the past, we could all just sit around and speculate, or someone could say, that's looking, superior longitudinal fasciculus. But that's not the same as saying, the central executive network should be protected. That's a very different discussion. So that's, I think, the next one. I think that the next, if you go to the futuristic thing, when we talk about the term oncofunctional balance, it's a concept, right? But the more information we actually have about the situation we're dealing with on the ground, the better we are at doing that. So a good example would be something like IDH1, right? So we know that those tumors, it's a disease-defining mutation, and that probably going for broke in different situations has different value. Well, if this is a tumor that's not near anything important, which increasingly is becoming less possible because we know more things are probably important. But let's say you were looking at this and trying to make a decision between an involved part of the central executive default mode or salience for an IDH, wild type versus a mutant. Well, it'd be helpful to know that before, because getting the pathology after doesn't help you in the operating room. And so unless you're going to do stage surgery over long periods of time, which is not realistic. I think that the other thing too, and there's other adjuncts that you can start to put in that improve your understanding of how do you make value decisions, which is ultimately what we do. Those computers can't do that. we're the ones who say, well, hey, this guy told me point blank that he wants to do everything humanly possible to squeeze out every minute of life and is willing to accept it. That is very different than somebody who says, if I can't do X, I don't want to live. Okay, those are very different people. And the computers can't make that decision. But what they can do is say, this is the most likely path for the tumor to spread given its anatomy. This is so maybe you want to focus your radiation on this versus somewhere else. Maybe if you're thinking about supramaximal resection, this area here doesn't have a hub anywhere near it, and it's not in a network, and it's actually the most likely path of spread. So instead of taking a 2 centimeter margin, like, a Halstedian mastectomy, we actually do this with more intelligence. So the more information we can put in to a learning system, the more likely we are to say, and all these things exist in some kind of concept. So what we're trying to do is build our tool into something that actually answers as many questions as possible on the ground, so we all make better decisions. We've all made bad decisions because we didn't have all the facts.
No, that's fantastic and very helpful. I thank you very much.
Yeah. Mike, any evidence of lateralization in these hubs or redundancy? So you have a hub on the left and the right, or do you see one isolated to only one hemisphere?
So that in 2 weeks, there's a talk on that, but the answer is, yeah, we just published that. We just published that in JNO a few months ago. So the answer is absolutely. But it's not, these aren't the measures for that. There's other ways to do measurements. And actually, if you look at the eigenvector and PageRank relationships, they show some very they measure things a little differently. And there's a lot of parts of the brain have roughly the same relationships. So on the other hand, notice we don't use raw numbers. We actually use ranks because there's a reason for it. It's everyone's values are a little different. So if you use raw values, you get different things. But if you rank it, the top hub versus the bottom hub, it's very, very consistent of who's number one in most people, which is always the brainstem. So we thought that made a lot of sense because we know the brainstem is the worst, most intolerant place you could be most of the time. But if you get down to it, there are other measures. So there's a measure called betweenness centrality, and betweenness centrality says how many of the shortest path. So you calculate the shortest path between everything and everything else. That's basically what you do. And then you say, what fraction of the shortest paths go through you? And if you're the guy who basically links up everybody to everybody else, even though you might not be that connected, if you basically shorten the topology of the brain, you probably are important in certain things. And it turns out that is extremely lateralized in the language areas. So it has interesting implications because, can we use this as a way to quickly figure out language laterality? Not sure yet. The problem is that you need enough training set of people who have right-sided speech, and it's a rare commodity. But then the second one is, what does this mean for cognitive? So for example, the frontal pole and central executive network areas are extremely good at shortening paths in the brain. It's actually, if you're in the frontal lobe, it's almost better to go to the pole and cross to the other side because you can hop on IFOF basically. Yeah. And so it tends to be part of a lot of the shortest paths, same with the temporal pole. So while these aren't cognitively, like they're not hubs in the sense that they immediately punish you when you cut them out, it might reduce fluid intelligence if you do too much of it.
Super interesting, man. I love hearing about it. Looking forward to that talk in 2 weeks then also.
Yeah, exciting work. Thanks very much for sharing it. I think our audience will find it as engaging as I did.
Absolutely. So we're coming up on the end of our talk time here. We'd like to keep it at 30 minutes to keep people interested and engaged. I'll invite the group listening to ask any questions before we sign off. But while they put anything in the chat, I just want to say again, we appreciate the support from Omniscient and the educational grant. We put a website link actually up when we post this on our YouTubes. That way people can go and obviously the advertisements around for this. And we want to thank you for your time. Without a doubt, it's always a pleasure. It looks like no group chat. So take care, everyone. Have a great afternoon. We'll see you all in 2 weeks for the next part of this. And we'll keep going forward.
Thanks for joining.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.